Part II. Combray. Section 13. I did not understand very clearly why, in order to refrain from going to the houses of people whom one did not know, it should be necessary to cling to one's independence, nor how that could give one the appearance of a savage or a bear. But what I did understand was this, that Legrandin was not altogether truthful when he said that he cared only for churches, moonlight, and youth. He cared also, he cared a very great deal, for people who lived in country houses, and would be so much afraid when in their company of incurring their displeasure that he would never dare to let them see that he numbered as well among his friends middle-class people, the families of solicitors and stockbrokers, preferring, if the truth must be known, that it should be revealed in his absence, when he was out of earshot, that judgment should go against him, if so it must, by default. In a word, he was a snob. Of course he would never have admitted all or any of this in the poetical language which my family and I so much admired. And if I asked him, "Do you know the Guermantes family?" Legrandin the talker would reply, "No, I have never cared to know them." But unfortunately the talker was now subordinated to another Legrandin, whom he kept carefully hidden in his breast, whom he would never consciously exhibit, because this other could tell stories about our own Legrandin, and about his snobbishness, which would have ruined his reputation forever. And this other Legrandin had replied to me already in that wounded look, that stiffened smile, the undue gravity of his tone in uttering those few words, in the thousand arrows by which our own Legrandin had instantaneously been stabbed and sickened, like a Saint Sebastian of snobbery. "Oh, how you hurt me! No, I do not know the Guermantes family. Do not remind me of the great sorrow of my life." And since this other, this irrepressible, dominant, despotic Legrandin, if he lacked our Legrandin's charming vocabulary, showed an infinitely greater promptness in expressing himself by means of what are called reflexes, it followed that, when Legrandin the talker attempted to silence him, he would already have spoken, and it would be useless for our friend to deplore the bad impression which the revelations of his alter ego must have caused, since he could do no more now than endeavor to mitigate them. This was not to say that Monsieur Legrandin was anything but sincere when he inveighed against snobs. He could not, from his own knowledge at least, be aware that he was one also, since it is only with the passions of others that we are ever really familiar, and what we come to find out about our own can be no more than what other people have shown us. Upon ourselves they react but indirectly, through our imagination, which substitutes for our actual primary motives other secondary motives, less stark and therefore more decent. Never had Legrandin's snobbishness impelled him to make a habit of visiting a duchess as such. Instead, it would set his imagination to make that duchess appear, in Legrandin's eyes, endowed with all the graces. He would be drawn towards the duchess, assuring himself the while that he was yielding to the attractions of her mind, and her other virtues, which the vile race of snobs could never understand. Only his fellow snobs knew that he was of their number, for, owing to their inability to appreciate the intervening efforts of his imagination, they saw in close juxtaposition the social activities of Legrandin and their primary cause. At home, meanwhile, we had no longer any illusions as to Monsieur Legrandin, and our relations with him had become much more distant. Mamma would be greatly delighted whenever she caught him red-handed in the sin, which he continued to call the unpardonable sin, of snobbery. As for my father, he found it difficult to take Legrandin's airs in so light, in so detached a spirit, and when there was some talk one year of sending me to spend the long summer holidays at Balbec with my grandmother, he said, "I must most certainly tell Legrandin that you are going to Balbec, to see whether he will offer you an introduction to his sister. He probably doesn't remember telling us that she lived within a mile of the place." My grandmother, who held that when one went to the seaside one ought to be on the beach from morning to night, to taste the salt breezes, and that one should not know any one in the place, because calls and parties and excursions were so much time stolen from what belonged by rights to the sea air, begged him on no account to speak to Legrandin of our plans. For already in her mind's eye she could see his sister, Madame de Combremère, alighting from her carriage at the door of our hotel, and as we were on the point of going out fishing, and obliging us to remain indoors all afternoon to entertain her. But Mamma laughed her fears to scorn, for she herself felt that the danger was not so threatening, and that Legrandin would show no undue anxiety to make us acquainted with his sister. And, as it happened, there was no need for any of us to introduce the subject of Balbec, for it was Legrandin himself who, without the least suspicion that we had ever had any intention of visiting those parts, walked into the trap uninvited one evening when we met him strolling on the banks of the Vivonne. "There are tints in the clouds this evening, violets and blues, which are very beautiful, are they not, my friend?" he said to my father. "Especially a blue which is far more floral than atmospheric, a cineraria blue which is surprising to see in the sky. And that little pink cloud there, has it not just the hint of some flower, a carnation or hydrangea? Nowhere, perhaps, except on the shores of the English Channel, where Normandy merges into Brittany, have I been able to find such copious examples of what you might call a vegetable kingdom in the clouds. Down there, close to Baalbec, among all those places which are still so uncivilized, there is a little bay, charmingly quiet, where the sunsets of the Auge Valley, those red and gold sunsets, which, all the same, I am very far from despising, seem commonplace and insignificant. For in that moist and gentle atmosphere these heavenly flower beds will break into blossom in a few moments in the evenings, incomparably lovely, and often lasting for hours before they fade. Others shed their leaves at once, and then it is more beautiful still to see the sky strewn with a scattering of their innumerable petals, sulphurous yellow and rosy red. In that bay, which they call the Opal Bay, the golden sands appear more charming still from being fastened, like fair Andromeda, to those terrible rocks of the surrounding coast, to that funereal shore, famed for the number of its wrecks, where every winter many a brave vessel falls a victim to the perils of the sea. Baalbec, the oldest bone in the geological skeleton that underlies our soil, the true armor, the sea, the Land's End, the accursed region which Anatole France, an enchanter whose works our young friend ought to read, has so well depicted beneath its eternal fogs, as though it were indeed the land of the Cimmerians in the Odyssey. Baalbec! Yes, they are building hotels there now, superimposing them upon its ancient and charming soil, which they are powerless to alter. How delightful it is, down there, to be able to step out at once into regions so primitive and so entrancing." "Indeed? And do you know any one at Baalbec?" inquired my father. "This young man is just going to spend a couple of months there with his grandmother, and my wife too, perhaps." Legrandin, taken unawares by the question at a moment when he was looking directly at my father, was unable to turn aside his gaze, and so concentrated it with steadily increasing intensity, smiling mournfully the while, upon the eyes of his questioner with an air of friendliness and frankness, and of not being afraid to look him in the face, until he seemed to have penetrated my father's skull, as it had been a ball of glass, and to be seeing, at the moment, a long way beyond and behind it, a brightly colored cloud which provided him with a mental alibi, and would enable him to establish the theory that, just when he was being asked whether he knew any one at Baalbec, he had been thinking of something else, and so had not heard the question. As a rule, these tactics make the questioner proceed to ask, "Why, what are you thinking about?" But my father, inquisitive, annoyed, and cruel, repeated, "Have you friends, then, in that neighborhood, that you know Baalbec so well?" In a final and desperate effort, the smiling gaze of Legrandin struggled to the extreme limits of its tenderness, vagueness, candor, and distraction. Then, feeling, no doubt, that there was nothing left for it now but to answer, he said to us, "I have friends all the world over, wherever there are companies of trees, stricken but not defeated, which have come together to offer a common supplication, with pathetic obstinacy, to an inclement sky which has no mercy upon them." "That is not quite what I meant," interrupted my father, obstinate as a tree and merciless as the sky. "I asked you in case anything should happen to my mother in law, and she wanted to feel that she was not all alone down there at the ends of the earth, whether you knew any of the people." "There, as elsewhere, I know every one, and I know no one," replied Legrandin, who was by no means ready yet to surrender. "Places I know well, people very slightly. But down there the places themselves seem to me just like people, rare and wonderful people, of a delicate quality which would have been corrupted and ruined by the gift of life. Perhaps it is a castle which you encounter upon the cliff's edge, standing there by the roadside, where it has halted to contemplate its sorrows before an evening sky, still rosy, through which a golden moon is climbing, while the fishing boats, homeward bound, creasing the watered silk of the channel, hoist its pennon at their mastheads and carry its colors. Or perhaps it is a simple dwelling house that stands alone, ugly, if anything, timid seeming, but full of romance, hiding from every eye some imperishable secret of happiness and disenchantment. "That land which knows not truth," he continued with Machiavellian subtlety, "that land of infinite fiction makes bad reading for any boy, and is certainly not what I should choose or recommend for my young friend here, who is already so much inclined to melancholy, for a heart already predisposed to receive its impressions. Climates that breathe amorous secrets and futile regrets may agree with an old and disillusioned man like myself, but they must always prove fatal to a temperament which is still unformed. Believe me," he went on with emphasis, "the waters of that bay, more Breton than Norman, may exert a sedative influence, though even that is of questionable value upon a heart which, like mine, is no longer unbroken, a heart for whose wounds there is no longer anything to compensate. But at your age, my boy, those waters are contraindicated. Good night to you, neighbors," he added, moving away from us with that evasive abruptness to which we were accustomed. And then, turning towards us, with a physicianly finger raised in warning, he resumed the consultation. "No Balbec before you are 50," he called out to me, "and even then it must depend on the state of the heart." My father spoke to him of it again, as often as we met him, and tortured him with questions. But it was labor in vain. Like that scholarly swindler who devoted to the fabrication of forged palimpsests a wealth of skill and knowledge and industry, the hundredth part of which would have sufficed to establish him in a more lucrative but an honorable occupation, Monsieur Legrandin, had we insisted further, would in the end have constructed a whole system of ethics and a celestial geography of Lower Normandy sooner than admit to us that within a mile of Balbec his own sister was living in her own house, sooner than find himself obliged to offer us a letter of introduction, the prospect of which would never have inspired him with such terror had he been absolutely certain, as from his knowledge of my grandmother's character he really ought to have been certain, that in no circumstances whatsoever would we have dreamed of making use of it. We used always to return from our walks in good time to pay Aunt Léonie a visit before dinner. In the first weeks of our Combray holidays, when the days ended early, we would still be able to see, as we turned into the Rue du Saint Esprit, a reflection of the western sky from the windows of the house, and a band of purple at the foot of the Calvary, which was mirrored further on in the pond, a fiery glow which, accompanied often by a cold that burned and stung, would associate itself in my mind with the glow of the fire, over which at that very moment was roasting the chicken that was to furnish me, in place of the poetic pleasure I had found in my walk, with the sensual pleasures of good feeding, warmth, and rest. But in summer, when we came back to the house, the sun would not have set, and while we were upstairs paying our visit to Aunt Léonie, its rays, sinking until they touched and lay along her window sill, would there be caught and held by the large inner curtains and the bands which tied them back to the wall, and split and scattered and filtered; and then at last would fall upon and inlay with tiny flakes of gold the lemon wood of her chest of drawers, illuminating the room in their passage with the same delicate, slanting, shadowed beams that fall among the boles of forest trees. But on some days, though very rarely, the chest of drawers would long since have shed its momentary adornments. There would no longer, as we turned into the Rue du Saint Esprit, be any reflection from the western sky burning along the line of window panes. The pond beneath the Calvary would have lost its fiery glow, sometimes indeed had changed already to an opalescent pallor, while a long ribbon of moonlight, bent and broken and broadened by every ripple upon the water's surface, would be lying across it from end to end. Then, as we drew near the house, we would make out a figure standing upon the doorstep, and Mamma would say to me, "Good heavens! There is Françoise looking out for us. Your aunt must be anxious, that means we are late." And without wasting time by stopping to take off our things, we would fly upstairs to my Aunt Léonie's room to reassure her, to prove to her by our bodily presence that all her gloomy imaginings were false; that, on the contrary, nothing had happened to us, but that we had gone the Guermantes way, and, good Lord, when one took that walk my aunt knew well enough that one could never say at what time one would be home. "There, Françoise," my aunt would say, "didn't I tell you that they must have gone the Guermantes way? Good gracious, they must be hungry. And your nice leg of mutton will be quite dried up now, after all the hours it's been waiting. What a time to come in! Well, and so you went the Guermantes way." "But, Léonie, I supposed you knew," Mamma would answer. "I thought that Françoise had seen us go out by the little gate through the kitchen garden." For there were, in the environs of Combray, two ways which we used to take for our walks, and so diametrically opposed that we would actually leave the house by a different door, according to the way we had chosen, the way towards Méséglise la Veneuse, which we called also Swann's way, because to get there one had to pass along the boundary of Monsieur Swann's estate, and the Guermantes way. Of Méséglise la Veneuse, to tell the truth, I never knew anything more than the way there. And the strange people who would come over on Sundays to take the air in Combray, people whom this time neither my aunt nor any of us would know at all, and whom we would therefore assume to be people who must have come over from Méséglise. As for Guermantes, I was to know it well enough one day, but that day had still to come, and, during the whole of my boyhood, if Méséglise was to me something as inaccessible as the horizon, which remained hidden from sight, however far one went, by the folds of a country which no longer bore the least resemblance to the country round Combray. Guermantes, on the other hand, meant no more than the ultimate goal, ideal rather than real, of their Guermantes way, a sort of abstract geographical term like the North Pole or the Equator. And so to take the Guermantes way in order to get to Méséglise, or vice versa, would have seemed to me as nonsensical a proceeding as to turn to the east in order to reach the west. Since my father used always to speak of the Méséglise way as comprising the finest view of a plain that he knew anywhere, and of the Guermantes way as typical of river scenery, I had invested each of them by conceiving them in this way as two distinct entities, with that cohesion, that unity, which belongs only to the figments of the mind. The smallest detail of either of them appeared to me as a precious thing, which exhibited the special excellence of the whole, while immediately beside them, in the first stages of our walk, before we had reached the sacred soil of one or the other, the purely material roads, at definite points on which they were set down as the ideal view over a plain, and the ideal scenery of a river, were no more worth the trouble of looking at them than, to a keen playgoer and lover of dramatic art, are the little streets which may happen to run past the walls of a theatre. But, above all, I set between them far more distinctly than the mere distance in miles and yards and inches which separated one from the other, the distance that there was between the two parts of my brain, in which I used to think of them one of those distances of the mind which time serves only to lengthen, which separate things irremediably from one another, keeping them forever upon different planes. And this distinction was rendered still more absolute because the habit we had of never going both ways on the same day or in the course of the same walk, but the Méséglise way one time and the Guermantes way another, shut them up, so to speak, far apart and unaware of each other's existence, in the sealed vessels, between which there could be no communication, of separate afternoons. End of Part Two, Section 12.